As I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, this afternoon we have with us Dr. William Portier. Dr. Portier is a noted theologian, author, respected teacher who will speak to us this afternoon on the Eucharist and the life of Dorothy Day. The life of this remarkable woman is filled with many twists and turns, many epiphanies that help to form a woman of conviction and faith. Dr. Portier will speak of her vision on the importance of making the Eucharist present in our everyday life. In addition, he will speak of the sacramental life of this national shrine and the relationship of Dorothy Day with the shrine. In particular, that day in December 1932, when Dorothy Day attended Mass here in this crypt church and offered a prayer that would change her life. Dorothy Day and the Eucharist is not something new. Dorothy was already writing about the mystical body of Christ in 1935. What is new is the perspective that time and history has given to scholars such as Dr. Portier, an historical and systematic theologian. Please welcome Dr. Portier.
Great. I'm very happy to be here.
Just in case.
The shrine and the crypt church, the shrine crypt, is a happy place for me, which I will explain. So I want to thank Dr. Geraldine Rowling and Monsignor Rossi for their invitation, and it's my honor to have a small part in the celebration of 100 years of worship at the National Shrine. With its intended evocation of the catacombs, I love this. The shrine crypt is one of those places in my life full of happy memories, of times that now seem so much simpler. It reminds me of graduate school in the late 1960s and later in the 1970s of writing my dissertation in the Theo Phil Library at Catholic U. In those days, grad students spent a lot of time in the crypt. I don't know if they still do. We came here to read, have lunch, and pray. Back then, the shrine cafeteria, much to our delight, had unlimited coffee refills. If one could afford a meal, the shrine cafeteria had real cooks. And then there was the crypt church, where we are now, and where students often came to pray and go to Mass. My favorite place to pray, was the dark cave-like chapel of the Immaculate Conception off to the left of the front of the crypt church. And then there was Paul VI's tiara and the bust of James Norris. You've probably never heard of James Norris. Norris was a disciple of Father Thomas A. Judge, about whom I wrote a biography, a very large one. And they tell me there's a couple of copies of it in the bookstore. After World War II, Norris worked together with then Monsignor Giovanni Montini, the future Pope Paul VI, on what would become eventually Catholic Relief Services. They became friends. At the urging of Paul VI, Norris was the only layperson to speak in the aula at the Second Vatican Council. And of course, he spoke in Latin and he wrote his own talk. He's said to have inspired Paul VI to give away his coronation tiara. So the tiara and the bust of Norris are reminders of their friendship. The crypt church was also the place where on December 8th, 1932, Dorothy Day made a pilgrimage to the National Shrine. She was on her way back to New York City from Washington, D.C. She was in D.C. covering a farmers' strike and march on Washington. Dorothy Day was a journalist. Much to the chagrin of her journalist father, who liked to cover horse racing, she was in those days a radical journalist. In 1932, Dorothy Day had only been a Catholic for about 4 years. She had yet to begin the Catholic worker. Not descended from recent immigrants, she was certainly not a demographically typical Catholic. Her Episcopalian and Methodist forebears had been of good white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stock. This is noteworthy because it meant that unlike most of her Catholic contemporaries, Dorothy never had to prove that she really belonged here in the United States. She was just here. This gave her a certain freedom. Like many a Catholic academic of my generation, I and my wife, Bonnie, were attracted to the Catholic worker, and we lived briefly at St. Joseph Catholic Worker House on South Avenue in Rochester, New York. We were young. We only lasted a couple of months. You might say we're failed Catholic workers. Nevertheless, Dorothy Day remains for me a beloved and exemplary heroic figure. Though I never met her, in what follows, I am going to refer to her by her first name. I mean it not as a sign of diminution, but as a sign of deep admiration and affection. Now in 2024, Dorothy is a servant of God. Her cause for canonization has recently been sent to Rome. People write books about her and make films about her. In 2015, Pope Francis mentioned her in his address to the Congress of the United States. Last year, he wrote a 5-page foreword to a new edition of her 1938 autobiography, From Union Square to Rome. Dorothy's bohemian socialist friends from New York's East Village would no doubt be shocked by her present notoriety. Having finished only 2 years at the University of Illinois at Urbana in 1916, she came to New York City as a budding young leftist. She wanted to work in radical journalism and change the world. Does that sound familiar? Eventually, she campaigned for women's right to vote, trained as a nurse, and lived for 4 years in a common law marriage. So how did she become what historian David O'Brien famously called at her death in 1980, the most significant, interesting, and influential person in the history of American Catholicism? It all began here in the Crypt Church, back on December 8th, 1932. Please have patience, and we will get there as fast as I can. We shall also get to the Eucharist, but first I thought Dorothy might need some introduction. Born in Brooklyn, Dorothy lived most of her radical life in a New York City full of great big stone Catholic parish churches. She noticed that it was the urban poor, or lower classes, who tended to fill those churches. She began to think of the Catholic Church as the church of the poor. This attracted her, despite its contrast with the church's significant political clout in New York City. She began occasionally stopping into various churches for a visit. Dorothy became pregnant in 1926. Her common law husband had serious reservations about marriage and religion. It became clear that he would not marry her. But she wanted her daughter to have something more, something she didn't have, a meaning, a purpose, a center. Tamar Teresa was baptized in July of 1927. Dorothy decided that she should be baptized too. She took instructions and was received into the church, conditionally baptized, on December 29th, 1927. But she didn't really know many Catholics, nor did she have the kind of network in the church that she had had on the New York left. Over the next 4 years or so, writing gigs took her and Tamar as far away as Mexico, California, and the Southwest. She eked out a living writing for Catholic publications like the recently founded Commonweal and America, and that is how she came to be here in the Crypt Church on December 8th, 1932. It was the middle of the Great Depression. Most Americans didn't own stock, so when the initial stock market crash came in September 1929, it had little effect on them. But as more and more banks failed, ordinary people began to feel the depression personally. They lost their jobs, banks foreclosed on their mortgages, farm production went down by a third, many small farmers lost their farms to foreclosures. Family farmers throughout the country began organizing to march on Washington. They were looking for relief in the form of emergency legislation. The Communist Party, then a live actor in the U.S. in 1932, was helping to organize the march. Commonweal sent Dorothy down to D.C. to cover the strike. America paid for the trip. The farmers and their treatment by the authorities moved Dorothy deeply. Entitled Real Revolutionists, her account of the Farmers' March appeared in Commonweal in 1933 in January. She also wrote about her experience with the farmers in 2 books, House of Hospitality in 1939 and The Long Loneliness in 1952. Independent or self-sustaining farmers were being evicted or forced to sell their farms. They asked the government for relief. Writing in 1939, Dorothy described her feelings as the marchers moved through the streets of Washington. I watched the ragged horde and thought to myself, these are Christ's poor. He was one of them. He was a man like other men, and he chose his friends among the ordinary workers. I felt that they were my people, that I was part of them. I had worked for them and with them in the past, and now I was a Catholic, and so could not be a communist. I could not join this united front of protest, and I wanted to. It was December 7th, the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Dorothy decided to make a pilgrimage to the shrine, at that time only partially completed. There she writes, I offered up a special prayer, a prayer which came with tears and with anguish, that some way would open up for me to use what talents I possessed for my fellow workers, for the poor. Her prayer was famously answered. When Dorothy got back to New York City, she found waiting for her at her apartment a French migrant, prodigiously eccentric, self-educated, vagabond intellectual. His name was Peter Morin. It was he who gave Dorothy the direction for her life as a Catholic and the vision to begin the Catholic worker. Dorothy wrote, the story of the Catholic worker begins with Peter. If it were not for Peter, there would be no Catholic worker, no houses of hospitality, no farming communes. They sold the first papers, the first Catholic workers, in New York's Union Square on May Day in 1933. From early on, Catholic workers made spiritual and emotional sense of what they did each day in terms of the doctrine of the mystical body of Christ. It gave visceral, spiritual underpinning to the fledgling movement. Dorothy was acutely aware that it was the body of Christ in the Eucharist that made the mystical body of Christ real. In the time that remains, I want to emphasize the intimate connection that these two forms of the resurrected body of Christ had for her. As St. Paul asks in 1 Corinthians, the bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because the bread is one, we, though many, are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Dorothy went to Mass and communion every morning and urged all the Catholic workers to do the same. Her old friend Eileen Egan, who lived for a long time at the New York Catholic Worker, testified that for Dorothy, the Mass was the central act of the day. Even when she traveled, she made sure never to miss it. But she found it very difficult to separate receiving communion, partaking of the one bread, from being part of the same body and acting accordingly. She found it hard to disentangle Jesus' real presence in the Eucharist from Jesus' presence in those in need. We might say that she had a special devotion to the judgment scene in Matthew 25. Whatever you did for one of the least of my brothers, that you did for me. This was the foundation of her devotion to the mystical body of Christ. She began a 1935 Catholic Worker article on the mystical body by quoting the early 2nd century first letter of Clement, which echoes St. Paul. She was writing in 1935, the middle of the Depression, the beginning of the war with Spain, all kinds of the Spanish Revolution, all kinds of stuff. Why do the members of Christ tear one another? Why do we rise up against our own body in such madness? Have we forgotten that we are all members one of another? In the agony in the garden, she went on to say, Jesus suffered not only his own agony, but also the agony of all those who have ever suffered, and the sins of those who inflicted suffering and death upon them. Since Christ suffered for all, she concluded, all are our brothers and sisters. She went so far as to tie the doctrine of the mystical body to the very purpose of the Catholic worker. She wrote in 1935, it is to promulgate this dogma, to bring it to the man in the street, that the Catholic worker is dedicated. Again, in another 1935 article, she wrote, the mystical body of Christ is a union. In the liturgy, we have the means to teach Catholics thrown apart by individualism that they are members of one body and that an injury to one is an injury to all. Her reference to the liturgy indicates that all of this was inseparable from the Mass and the Eucharist. The liturgical movement in the U.S. began in the 20s. I've only got like a page and a half to go. You hang in there. Its main center was at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. The Benedictines at St. John's had a special affinity for Dorothy and the Catholic worker, visited the New York house frequently, and kept them supplied with all the books that liturgical press published. Most notably, the monks supplied the workers with Compline books so that they could say the evening hours of the prayer of the church every day. In 1931, amid the Great Depression, Pope Pius XI had called in Quadragesimo Anno for a reconstruction of the social order. Benedictine monk Virgil Michael was a leader of the liturgical movement and an advisor to Dorothy Day. Commenting on Pius XI's encyclical, Michael asked, Where are we to find the Christian spirit needed to renew the social order? Quoting back to Pius X, he answered, "From participation in the sacred mysteries and the public and solemn prayers of the Church." Then Michael asked, "Well, what is the basic idea of this liturgy?" He answered simply, "The mystical body of Christ." Dorothy would have agreed. As we gather here today in the shrine, the 2024 National Eucharistic Congress is taking place in Indianapolis. This, our 10th National Eucharistic Congress, will end tomorrow. In 1976, Philadelphia hosted an International Eucharistic Congress. The Philadelphia Congress brought Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa of Calcutta together on the Congress stage on August 6, 1976. They had known each other since 1960. The title of the Congress was "The Eucharist and the Hungers of the Human Heart." Both Dorothy and Mother Teresa expressed their nervousness at speaking before such a large crowd. I don't have to worry about that. But both traveled to Philadelphia and both spoke. Both their remarks emphasized the importance of making the Eucharist present in our everyday life for the naked, for the hungry, the homeless, and for peace. And both of these holy women have spoken here in the shrine. Almost 50 years after the International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia, tomorrow in Indianapolis, the Church in the U.S. will conclude our National Eucharistic Revival and our 10th National Eucharistic Congress. The revival has focused on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. At this time, it would be well to recall Dorothy's saintly memory. May her example remind us that we can't separate Christ's real and true sacramental presence from his presence in the homeless and the hungry and the migrants. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Portier, for your time, for your insight into the life of a remarkable woman. I'm always happy to hear about Dorothy Day, especially her connection here at the National Shrine. It's nice to have known that a saint in the making received her calling, if you will, in this sacred place. So thank you, Doctor. Thank you, one and all. Have a blessed day and a very good weekend.